Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The forest path leads to darkness. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The Decision. The weekend had promised a break from the suffocating routine of daily life. Chris, his girlfriend Emily, and their friends Matt and Sarah piled into Chris's battered SUV, the excitement of escaping to a remote cabin in the woods palpable. The cabin was miles from the nearest town, tucked away in a secluded part of the forest where cell service was a distant memory. Perfect for a weekend of disconnecting, or so they thought. The drive was long, winding through narrow roads that grew more isolated with every mile. Matt, sitting in the passenger seat, cracked a joke about horror movies and isolated cabins, but the laugh it earned felt strained. Sarah, in the back seat next to Emily, stared out the window, biting her lip. She couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her stomach the moment they left town. As they pulled into the gravel driveway, the cabin came into view. It was rustic, nestled among towering pines, but something about the way the trees loomed over it felt wrong. Almost as if the forest was swallowing it whole. "You sure this is the place?" Emily asked, her voice wavering slightly. Chris shot her a reassuring smile. "Yeah, this is it. Relax, it'll be fun." But even he couldn't ignore the prickling sensation at the back of his neck. As they unloaded the car, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that sounded almost like whispers. Sarah caught sight of an old man walking down the road, his face weathered and creased with age. He stopped when he saw them, his eyes narrowing. "You folks staying at the old cabin?" he asked, his voice gruff. "Yeah," Matt replied, trying to sound casual. "Why?" The old man shook his head slowly. "Just be careful. That forest's got a way of keeping folks who wander too far." With that ominous warning, he walked away, leaving the group in an uncomfortable silence. Chris forced a laugh, dismissing the man's words as small-town superstition. But as they made their way inside, the unease lingered. Later that afternoon, while exploring the area around the cabin, they stumbled upon an old, overgrown path leading deeper into the woods. It was barely noticeable, hidden beneath fallen leaves and creeping vines. Chris hesitated, his instinct telling him to turn back, but Matt was already pushing forward. "Come on, guys. What's the worst that could happen?" Matt called over his shoulder. Reluctantly, they followed, the dense trees closing in around them, the sounds of the forest growing quieter with each step. By the time they realized just how isolated they were, it was too late to turn back. The path had swallowed them whole. Chapter 2. The First Signs. The silence in the forest pressed in on them like a heavy weight, each step sinking them deeper into the unknown. The overgrown path twisted and turned unpredictably, leading the group further away from the safety of the cabin. Chris kept glancing back at Emily, Matt, and Sarah, his gut churning with unease. "Are we sure this is a good idea?" Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We're fine," Matt replied, trying to sound confident, but his eyes betrayed him. He kept rubbing the back of his neck, as if trying to shake off a lingering discomfort. They pressed on, but the atmosphere grew thicker with every passing minute. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness that seemed to grow heavier the further they went. Then came the first sign. It was subtle at first. Sarah checked her watch and frowned. "Didn't we just check the time? How is it already an hour later?" Chris stopped, looking at his phone. The screen flickered, then went black. "That's weird. My phone's dead." I had a full battery. The others checked their phones, each one dead. Panic flickered in their eyes. As they moved forward, strange noises began to echo through the trees. Unsettling sounds that seemed to come from nowhere, low whispers, faint footsteps, and the distant sound of something cracking in the underbrush. The feeling of being watched became impossible to ignore. "I swear, something's following us," Sarah whispered, her eyes darting around. She was growing increasingly paranoid, jumping at every sound, every shadow. "We should go back." "No," Matt argued. "There's a logical explanation for this. Maybe it's just animals, or we're lost," Chris interrupted, his voice tight. "This path keeps changing. It doesn't look the same as when we came in." The trees around them seemed to shift subtly, the path narrowing and twisting in ways that made no sense. Emily's breath hitched as she stared at the trees. For a moment, she thought she saw a face pale, ghostly, and watching her from the shadows. She blinked, and it was gone. As if sensing their unease, the forest began to play tricks on their minds. Chris saw flickers of movement in the corner of his vision, his younger brother, whom he hadn't seen since that horrible night years ago. Emily heard her father's voice, cold and accusing, echoing through the trees. It was Matt who finally broke the tension. "Guys, where's Sarah?" They turned, hearts pounding. Sarah was gone. Her footprints led off the path, vanishing into the dense forest. Panic surged through the group, and all thoughts of logic and reason disappeared as the reality of their situation hit them. They weren't alone in the forest, and something or someone was hunting them. Chapter 3: The Descent in Madness. Panic clawed at their throats as they called Sarah's name, their voices echoing through the eerie silence of the forest. The oppressive darkness had swallowed her whole, leaving nothing but a void where she once stood. Chris clenched his fists, fighting the urge to scream. Emily, trembling, clutched his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "This is your fault, Matt." Emily spat, her voice sharp with accusation. "You pushed us to go further. Now Sarah is gone." Matt's face twisted with anger and guilt. "Don't you dare put this on me. We all agreed to go down this path. How was I supposed to know?" "Stop it!" Chris's voice cut through the rising tension. He could feel the forest feeding off their fear, amplifying it. "Arguing won't bring Sarah back. We need to stay focused and find her." But staying focused was easier said than done. The forest seemed to close in around them, warping the landscape into something unrecognizable. The trees twisted and shifted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Paths that should have been familiar became foreign, the ground beneath their feet uneven and treacherous. Every step felt like they were sinking deeper into the heart of the forest's malevolence. Whispers floated on the wind, soft and sinister, just out of reach. They sounded like Sarah at first, calling for help. But when they followed the voice, it led them to nothing but shadows. And then the voices began to change, morphing into something darker, taunting them, mocking their helplessness. Matt's rational facade cracked as the whispers grew louder. He pressed his hands to his ears, trying to drown out the insidious murmurs. "This isn't real. It's just in our heads. It has to be." But the more he tried to convince himself, the more the forest toyed with his sanity. He started seeing figures in the fog, ghostly apparitions that flickered in and out of existence. Faces from his past, people he had wronged. They stared at him with hollow eyes, accusing him of sins he could never atone for. Emily wasn't faring any better. The darkness played tricks on her mind, dredging up memories she had buried deep. Her father's cold, distant face appeared in the shadows, his voice dripping with disappointment. "You've always been a failure, Emily. Just like your mother." Chris tried to hold them together, but the weight of his own guilt was crushing him. The forest knew his deepest regret, and it exploited it mercilessly. He saw his brother everywhere, his younger brother, whose death had haunted him for years. In the shifting shadows, Chris relived that night over and over again, watching helplessly as the tragedy unfolded. Then came the twist that shattered what little composure they had left. Deep in the woods, they stumbled upon an ancient ritual site, a circle of stones covered in strange symbols, glowing faintly in the dim light. In the center lay a cursed object, a grotesque, twisted idol that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. This was causing it, Chris whispered, horrified. The forest, the voices, everything. It's all connected to this. But the realization brought no relief, only despair. The forest had trapped them, and the only way out was to confront the curse head-on. As they stood before the ancient site, the reality of their situation sank in. There was no easy escape. The forest wasn't just playing with their minds, it was feeding on their souls. And it wasn't going to let them go without a fight. Chapter 4. The Haunting. Forest seemed to breathe, its ancient presence pressing down on them from every direction. The twisted trees loomed overhead, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. Chris, Emily, and Matt stood around the cursed idol, its grotesque form glowing faintly in the dim light. They were trapped, lost in a nightmare that had no end. We need to survive. Find a way out, Chris said, his voice firm but hollow. He didn't believe his own words. The forest had stripped them of hope, but survival was all they had left. Matt nodded, though his eyes flicked nervously toward the shifting shadows. We should stay together. No more splitting up. Emily didn't respond. She was staring into the darkness, her mind far away. The image of her father haunted her, his disappointed face etched into her memory. She shook her head, trying to focus. We need to keep moving. If we stay here, it'll drive us insane. But as they moved through the dense underbrush, the forest seemed to fight back. The paths twisted and turned, leading them in circles. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow held a threat. The sense of being watched intensified, a constant presence lurking just beyond their vision. And then came the voices. They started as faint whispers, barely audible over the sound of their footsteps. At first, they thought it was the wind, but the voices grew louder, more distinct. They called out to them by name, luring them deeper into the woods. Emily, the voice, was her father's, cold and mocking. You'll never escape. You'll die here, just like your mother. Emily clutched her head, trying to block out the sound, but it was inside her mind, seeping into her thoughts. She could see him now, standing just ahead, his face twisted in a cruel sneer. No, you're not real, she whispered, but the line between reality and illusion had blurred. Chris wasn't faring any better. His younger brother's voice echoed in his ears, taunting him. You could have saved me, Chris, but you didn't. You let me die. He stumbled forward, the weight of guilt pressing down on him. Every step felt heavier, the forest pulling him deeper into despair. He saw his brother's face in every shadow, accusing him, haunting him. Matt, the most rational of the group, tried to keep it together. But even he couldn't escape the forest's influence. He saw doppelgangers, twisted versions of himself appearing in the fog, their eyes hollow and dead. They grinned at him, their faces contorted in grotesque expressions. This is what you'll become, Matt, they whispered. Just another lost soul. Forest was relentless, using their guilt and regrets against them. They stumbled through the woods, their sense of direction completely shattered. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost all meaning. Finally, they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a massive, ancient tree, its roots twisted and blackened. Carved into its trunk were the same symbols they had seen at the ritual site. But there was something else, something that sent a shiver down Chris's spine. Bodies, the remains of those who had come before them, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. This is where it ends, Chris whispered, horrified. The forest consumes everyone who enters. It's feeding on us. As the realization sank in, the oppressive atmosphere grew heavier, almost suffocating. They were standing at the heart of the forest's power, a place where the malevolent force was strongest. And now they knew the horrifying truth. The forest wasn't just alive. It was hungry. Chapter 5. The Break. The forest's hunger seemed to grow more palpable with each passing minute, feeding off their fear, tearing at the fragile threads that held them together. Chris, Emily, and Matt huddled near the ancient tree, their breaths shallow and rapid, eyes darting toward every rustle in the shadows. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they were louder, more insistent. Each voice clawed at their sanity, mocking them, pulling them deeper into despair. I can't do this anymore. Matt's voice cracked, his usual calm demeanor shattered. His hands trembled as he clutched his head, his eyes wide with terror. This place, it's messing with our minds. We're all going to die here. Chris reached out, trying to calm him. Matt, we need to stay strong. If we fall apart now. Stay strong? For what? Matt interrupted, his voice rising to a frantic pitch. We're trapped. Can't you see that? This forest, it's not just playing with us. It's going to kill us. One by one. Emily, who had been staring blankly at the ground, suddenly stood up, her eyes blazing with a mix of anger and desperation. Then let's leave. Split up. We have a better chance alone than together. Chris turned to her, shock and disbelief on his face. Are you serious? Splitting up is suicide. We need to stick together. Stick together. Emily spat, her voice dripping with bitterness. Look where that's gotten us. Maybe if we weren't dragging each other down, one of us could find a way out of this nightmare. Matt's eyes flicked between Chris and Emily, uncertainty clouding his expression. The bond they had once shared as friends was unraveling. Paranoia crept into Matt's thoughts, whispering that maybe Chris and Emily were hiding something, that they were conspiring against him. Maybe Emily's right, Matt muttered, his voice barely audible. Maybe we'd be better off on our own. Chris stared at him in disbelief. You're both losing it. This forest is getting into your heads. We can't let it tear us apart. But it was too late. The rift had formed, and the forest, sensing their vulnerability, closed in. That's when they heard the scream. It was a blood-curdling, agonizing cry that echoed through the trees, freezing them in place. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was in unimaginable pain. And it was close. Chris sprinted toward the direction of the scream, his heart pounding. Emily and Matt hesitated, fear paralyzing them. But they couldn't let him go alone. They burst through the trees into a small clearing, and there, at the center, lay a crumpled figure. It was Rachel, another friend who had ventured into the forest with them. She hadn't made it. Her body was twisted in an unnatural position, her face contorted in a frozen expression of terror. No, 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 no. Emily's voice broke as she dropped to her knees beside Rachel. Chris stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. But Matt stepped back, his eyes wide with horror. He had seen something they hadn't, a shadowy figure, lurking at the edge of the clearing. It was watching them, its presence suffocating, malevolent. Run! Matt screamed, his voice cracking as he turned and bolted into the woods. The others didn't have time to react. By the time they looked up, Matt was gone, swallowed by the darkness, and they were left standing alone, surrounded by the forest that wanted nothing more than to devour them whole. Chapter 6. The Final Push. The forest was alive, its darkness a living, breathing entity that sought to consume them whole. Chris and Emily trudged through the tangled undergrowth, their bodies bruised and their spirits battered. The loss of their friend Rachel and Matt's sudden disappearance had left them hollow, but there was no room for surrender. They had to escape. There was no other choice. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees whispering in a language they couldn't understand. Shadows danced at the periphery of their vision, always just out of reach. The air was thick with an oppressive energy that sapped their strength and will. Each step felt heavier than the last, the forest's unseen hands dragging at their feet. Chris glanced at Emily, who was pale and trembling, but her eyes were set with grim determination. "We need to find out what's causing this," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's the only way we'll get out of here." Emily nodded, swallowing hard. "The forest, it's manipulating us, using our fears against us. If we can find the source, maybe we can end this." Their search led them deeper into the heart of the forest, where the darkness was impenetrable. The forest's malevolence became tangible, pressing down on them with an unbearable weight. They encountered horrifying apparitions, twisted versions of their own fears. Emily saw her mother's face, distorted and weeping, while Chris was confronted with a vision of his younger brother, lifeless and accusing. The forest's supernatural wrath grew more intense, manifesting as an unnerving cacophony of screams, whispers, and eerie laughter. The ground beneath them seemed to shift, opening up into gaping chasms that threatened to swallow them whole. The trees moved, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to drag them into the abyss. Finally, they stumbled upon a clearing, a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness that surrounded them. At the center was a stone altar covered in ancient runes and drenched in a strange, pulsating light. On the altar lay a relic, an old, ornate book bound in dark leather. Its presence radiated a palpable malevolence. "This must be it," Chris said, awe and fear mingling in his voice. "The source of the forest's power." Emily approached the altar, her eyes locked on the book. "We need to destroy it. It's the only way to stop this." As she reached for the book, the forest roared in fury. The shadows converged, forming a monstrous figure, a manifestation of the forest's darkest essence. It towered over them, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. Its eyes glowed with an insatiable hunger, and its voice was a thunderous echo of all their worst nightmares. "No!" Chris shouted, pushing Emily aside as the figure lunged. He grabbed a branch and swung at the creature, but it was like hitting smoke. Emily grabbed the book, her hands shaking as she held it over the altar. "We have to finish this," the monster roared, its rage shaking the very ground beneath them. Chris and Emily braced themselves, the final confrontation imminent. Their hearts pounded, the weight of their fears pressing down on them as they prepared for the ultimate battle against the darkness that had consumed the forest. This was their last chance. If they failed, the forest's hunger would claim them and anyone else who dared to enter. Chapter 7. The Confrontation. The clearing was a battleground of chaos. The malevolent entity, a shadowy leviathan of pure malice, loomed over Chris and Emily. Its form was a swirling mass of darkness, eyes glowing with an otherworldly fire, its presence suffocating. Every fiber of their being screamed at them to flee, but they had no choice but to face the darkness head-on. Emily gripped the ancient book tightly, her knuckles white. Chris stood beside her, his face set in a determined grimace. The air crackled with malevolent energy as the entity's rage intensified. It lashed out, tendrils of darkness whipping through the air like whips, trying to ensnare them. "Do it now," Chris yelled, barely audible over the roar of the creature. "We don't have much time." Emily nodded, her eyes wide but resolute. She began chanting the incantations from the book, her voice trembling but steady. The words felt foreign on her tongue, their power palpable as they resonated through the clearing. The forest seemed to writhe in response, the very ground beneath them trembling. The entity recoiled, its form flickering as if in pain. It screamed, a guttural, primal sound that reverberated through the forest. Shadows writhed and contorted around them, each whisper a tormenting reminder of their deepest fears. The forest was fighting back, its influence manifesting as nightmarish visions. Chris could see Emily's struggle as she forced herself to continue the incantation. Her face was pale, sweat dripping from her brow. He fought back the fear clawing at his chest and leapt into the fray. He swung at the shadowy tendrils, trying to keep them at bay, his makeshift weapon barely making a dent. The entity lashed out at him, its dark tendrils wrapping around his legs, pulling him toward the ground. Chris gritted his teeth, trying to free himself. Emily's voice wavered as she struggled to maintain the spell. The creature's rage was unrelenting, its form growing more insubstantial but more vicious with every moment. "Emily, you have to finish it," Chris shouted through gritted teeth. Emily's hands trembled as she reached the final incantation. The words came out in a rush, each syllable a desperate plea for salvation. The book's pages began to glow with a blinding light, and the entity howled in agony, its form beginning to dissolve. With one final guttural scream, the darkness erupted, a wave of shadow and flame that washed over the clearing. Chris shielded his eyes, feeling the intense heat and pressure. The entity's presence seemed to implode, collapsing in on itself in a blinding burst of light. The forest fell silent, the oppressive weight that had hung over them lifted, the shadows receding. Chris and Emily stood amidst the wreckage, breathing heavily. The book lay on the ground, its dark energy now subdued. As the first rays of dawn began to pierce the forest canopy, they surveyed the clearing. The forest had returned to its natural state, the malevolent energy gone. They had survived, but the ordeal had left its mark. Chris looked at Emily, his eyes reflecting both relief and sorrow. They had faced their fears and survived, but at a cost. The forest had changed them, revealing their darkest fears and testing their resolve. The finality of their victory was bittersweet. They had conquered the darkness, but the experience had forever altered them. They were survivors, marked by the forest's malevolent grip, but they had emerged with a renewed sense of strength and resilience. As they made their way out of the forest, the dawn's light promised a new beginning. But the memories of their ordeal would linger, a haunting reminder of the darkness they had faced and the strength they had found within themselves. Chapter 8: The Aftermath. The sun was a blinding beacon as Chris and Emily stumbled out of the forest's edge, their clothes torn and their faces smeared with grime. The sight of the small town nestled in the valley, bathed in the early morning light, was both a relief and a stark contrast to the nightmare they had left behind. The forest, once a suffocating presence, was now just a dark smudge on the horizon. The town's familiar sights were a comfort, but they did little to ease the haunting echoes of their ordeal. The people of the town were kind, offering them food, shelter, and concern, but no amount of warmth could erase the scars the forest had left on their souls. They were alive, but the forest's dark grip had marked them in ways they could not escape. As days turned into weeks, Chris and Emily tried to return to their normal lives, but the forest's influence lingered. Emily would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, her heart racing from nightmares of shadowy tendrils and whispering voices. Chris avoided mirrors, afraid of seeing something that wasn't there, a lingering shadow or a glint of malevolent eyes. Every creak of the floorboards or rustle of leaves outside their windows set their nerves on edge. One evening, as Emily was sorting through her belongings, she found a small, ornate box buried deep in her bag. She didn't recall packing it, and its presence was unsettling. Inside, nestled among the clutter, was a single page from the ancient book, the one they had destroyed. Its ink was still fresh, as if it had been written just hours before. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She showed it to Chris, whose face paled. "We must have missed something," he said, his voice trembling. "The forest's darkness, it's not gone." Determined to understand, they visited the town's library, searching through old records and local legends. What they found sent chills down their spines. There were accounts of similar occurrences, a pattern of disappearances and dark rituals in the forest, always followed by sightings of ominous figures and unsettling phenomena. It seemed the forest had a way of leaving its mark, a curse that continued to thrive beyond its boundaries. As the days wore on, they began to notice subtle, strange occurrences, flickers of movement at the edge of their vision, whispers on the wind, and the persistent feeling of being watched. The forest's darkness had not been vanquished. It had simply found a new way to seep into their lives. The final twist came when Chris discovered an old photograph among his things, one he didn't remember taking. It showed him and Emily standing at the forest's edge. But in the background was a shadowy figure that hadn't been there before. The image was a chilling reminder that their ordeal was far from over. As they tried to make sense of their lingering horror, Chris and Emily realized that the forest's influence had become a part of them, a dark legacy that would never fully fade. They had survived, but they were forever haunted by the knowledge that the darkness they had fought was still out there, waiting just beyond the veil of their everyday lives.